Poverty and inequality. We hear these words thrown around all the time, right? But what do they actually mean? And how are they really shaping our world? Today, we're going to peel back the layers and go way beyond the headlines to get at the numbers, the policies, and, the human stories behind it all. All right, let's get into it.
Let's start with just one number, $17. Now, what does that mean? Well, for an American family of 3 living at the poverty line, that's their food budget for the entire day, $17. So how on earth do we even get to a number like that? Well, to figure that out, we have to understand this big idea that shaped policy for decades, the poverty line.
The poverty line. It's a phrase we all know. But have you ever actually stopped and wondered, where did that line come from? Who drew it? The story behind it and what it means for us today? Well, it might just surprise you. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of that line, let's set the stage a bit. You probably remember this. Not too long ago, movements like Occupy Wall Street just exploded onto the global stage. They got all of us asking some really tough questions about fairness, opportunity, and this massive growing gap between the wealthiest 1% and, well, everyone else. That whole conversation, that's about inequality. But before we can really tackle that, we have to understand poverty itself, and they're not the same thing. Think of it like this. Poverty is an absolute thing. It's about not having enough, period. Inequality, though, that's relative. It's about some people having a massive feast while others are fighting for the scraps. You really got to get the first one to understand the second. So, back to that line. Where did it come from? Well, it all goes back to 1963 and a truly brilliant government economist named Molly Orshansky. She had this pretty revolutionary idea. She figured, hey, if you can calculate the absolute rock-bottom cost to feed a family a healthy diet, you could use that as a building block to measure poverty itself. And her method was honestly really simple and kind of elegant. First, figure out the cost of a basic nutritious food plan. Second, notice that back then, the average family spent about a third of their money on food. So, third, just multiply that food cost by 3, and boom, you've got the poverty line. Now here's the catch. That basic formula is still used today, just adjusted for inflation. But think about it. Today, we spend way less on food as a share of our budget, and a whole lot more on things Molly's formula barely considers, like housing, childcare, and healthcare. So even if the measurement isn't perfect, it paints a really stark picture. What these numbers really show us is that poverty doesn't hit everyone the same way, not even close. It hits kids and communities of color way harder, creating this vicious cycle of disadvantage that is just incredibly difficult to break.
But that's the question, isn't it? If we know who is in poverty, and we have all these programs that are supposed to help, why is it so ridiculously hard for people to climb out? Well, the answer lies in this cruel, frustrating paradox that economists have a name for: the poverty trap. And this gets us to a really tough question that policymakers have wrestled with for decades. Is it possible that the very systems we've designed to lift people up could actually be holding them down?
Okay, let me make this real for you. Just imagine you're a single parent, you're working a tough minimum wage job. You finally get a small raise. But that little bit of extra income means you now make too much to qualify for your food assistance or your housing voucher. So suddenly, you're working harder, but you're actually taking home less money. You're worse off. That right there is the poverty trap.
It is literally like running on a treadmill. You are sweating, you're putting in all the effort, you're trying so hard to move forward, but you're just not going anywhere. It's an absolutely soul-crushing experience, and it can make it feel like the whole system is rigged, punishing you for trying to do the right thing and get ahead.
Okay, so the poverty trap is a huge piece of this puzzle. It shows just how complicated all of this is. But to really get the whole story, we need to zoom out a bit, away from the individual struggle of poverty, and look at the much bigger picture of economic inequality. So let's just make this crystal clear. Think of the economy like a ladder. Poverty is about being stuck on the very bottom rung, maybe even hanging on by your fingernails. Inequality, on the other hand, is about the distance between that bottom rung and the top rung, and how, over the years, that distance has just gotten wider and wider and wider. And this chart, this isn't just a bunch of numbers. This is a snapshot of that ladder. I mean, just look at it. The top 20% of households in the U.S. take home more than half of all the income, over 52%. Meanwhile, the entire bottom 20% gets just 3%. It's just a shocking picture of the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Now, economists have a fancy tool to visualize this called the Lorenz curve. But forget the fancy name for a second. Just look at the lines. That straight line? That's a fancy world where everything is perfectly equal. The curved line? Well, that's us.
That's reality. And here's all you need to know. The bigger the gap between those two lines, the deeper that curve bows down, the more unequal a society is.
So if we have a pretty clear picture of the problems, both poverty and inequality, what can we actually do? Well, the good news is governments have a whole toolbox of policies they can use to try and make things a little more fair.
And these programs, together, they form what we call a safety net, and it's designed to catch people when they fall on hard times. You've got TANF, which is direct cash help for families. The EITC, which is a tax credit to boost the paychecks of low-income workers. SNAP, which helps put food on the table. And Medicaid, which provides life-saving health care. Each one is a really important piece of the puzzle.
And there's always a but, isn't there? Here's where things get really, really complicated. Because while all these programs are critical, they bring up a huge question, a fundamental debate that's been raging in economics for centuries.
You've probably heard this argument before, right? It's the classic view. It says there's a direct trade-off. If you push too hard for more equality, say by taxing the rich to help the poor, you risk killing the incentive for people to work hard, to innovate, to invest. And if that happens, the entire economic pie gets smaller for everybody. But is it really that simple?
Well, there's another, more hopeful view. It argues that some policies can actually grow the pie and slice it up more fairly at the very same time. I mean, think about something like public education. It's a way of redistributing resources for sure, but it's also an incredible investment in our future. A smarter, healthier, better educated workforce is a more productive workforce, and that's a win-win. That lifts everybody up.
So in the end, this whole debate, it isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet or curves on a graph. It's really about our values. It's about what kind of society we actually want to live in. Do we want one where a person's starting point determines their whole life, or one where everyone gets a real fair shot at success? That's the question. And the choice, well, it's up to us.